She thought she was just helping a hungry old man. Until a convoy of military trucks rolled up, revealing the truth about who he really was. The neon sign outside Benny's diner flickered against the darkened highway, casting a weak red glow over the parking lot. It wasn't much. Just a roadside stop off Interstate 65 in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where the coffee was strong. The pie was homemade, and the floors creaked with every step. The kind of place that never made headlines, never saw much change, but always had a story to tell if you paid attention. Tasha Reynolds, 42, had been part of this place for more than a decade. Her uniform, a blue dress with a white apron, was second nature now, just like the hum of the kitchen, the sizzle of the fryer, and the endless loop of country songs from a jukebox that barely worked. It was close to midnight, and the crowd had thinned out. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing their coffees, while old Mr. Dobbs at the corner booth stirred his chili the same way he had every night for the past 5 years. A couple of high school kids giggled over a shared milkshake, sneaking glances at their phones. And then, there he was. She spotted him just outside the window, standing near the entrance, caught in the glow of the street lamp. His coat hung off his frame, like it belonged to another man, the fabric torn at the seams. His boots were scuffed, nearly split at the soles. His hands, rough, lined with years of labor, or maybe war, shook slightly as he counted the crumpled bills in his palm. She'd seen him before, not often, but enough to remember. Always lingering, always hesitating at the door, like he was working up the courage to step inside, but never quite crossing that line. Some nights he walked away. Other nights, he stood there, just long enough to remind the world he still existed. Tonight, he pushed the door open. A gust of cold air swept through the diner, making the overhead lights flicker. The bell above the door let out a tired jingle. Tasha wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him. "You coming in, or you just gonna let all the heat out?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes searching his. The man hesitated, then shuffled forward. I was just looking." His voice was gravelly, worn down like an old road. "You can look just fine from inside," she said, motioning toward an empty booth. He hesitated again, his gaze flicking toward the counter, where the truckers sat, then back to the door, like he was debating leaving. Tasha didn't give him the chance. She grabbed a menu, walked past him, and placed it on the table closest to the window. "Sit," she said simply. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the seat, his joints stiff, his shoulders drawn inward like he was bracing for something. He reached for the menu with careful hands, his fingers stopping on the cheapest item, the cup of soup and half a sandwich combo. She saw the math in his eyes, the silent calculation of what he could afford versus what he needed. "I'll just take the soup," he murmured, clearing his throat, as if to sound more sure of himself. "Potato, if you got it." Tasha didn't move. Instead, she leaned on the counter, arms crossed. "How about the sandwich too?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Soup's fine." "Yeah, well, it's a slow night," she said, shrugging. "Kitchen's got to stay busy, or they'll start bothering me." The lie rolled off her tongue with ease, and before he could argue, she turned toward the kitchen window. "Hey, Lou. Bowl of potato soup and a turkey sandwich. Extra mustard," she called out, winking at the cook. Lou, a man of few words, gave her a glance, then nodded. "Already working on it." The old man, Walter Gaines, as she later learned, shifted in his seat, his hands folding and unfolding over the tabletop. I'll pay you back, he said. Voice quiet, almost ashamed. Tasha waved a hand. Don't worry about it. No, really. He insisted, his watery blue eyes meeting hers. Someday. She just smiled. Eat while it's hot. And just like that. A single act of kindness set something in motion that no one saw coming. Walter hesitated before reaching for the spoon. His fingers, rough and calloused, hovered over the bowl as if touching it might shatter whatever fragile dignity he had left. Tasha watched from behind the counter, pretending to wipe a glass that was already spotless. She knew that look, the quiet shame of someone who wasn't used to taking handouts. But it wasn't a handout, it was a meal. And meals weren't charity. They were human. Lou slid the plate of turkey sandwich onto the counter. His face unreadable as always. Extra mustard, just like you said. Tasha grabbed it and set it in front of Walter. Before he could protest, he looked up. A flicker of something in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe. Maybe something deeper. You didn't have to. It's already made, she interrupted, sliding into the booth across from him. No sense in letting good food go to waste. For a moment, he just sat there staring at her, like he was trying to figure out if there was a catch. There wasn't. So finally, he picked up the spoon and took his first bite. The room around them carried on like any other night. The truckers grumbled about fuel prices. Mr. Dobbs stirred his chili in slow, deliberate circles. The kids in the corner argued over a song on the jukebox. But here, in this booth, something was happening. Walter ate slowly, carefully, like each bite needed to last. He chewed the sandwich deliberately, savoring it in a way most people forgot how to do. Between bites, he finally spoke. I used to come through here a long time ago. Tasha raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Back when I was driving, he said, nodding toward the window, as if looking past the present into some other time. Long hauls. East Coast to Texas. Sometimes further. She leaned back. Truck driver? Not always, he muttered. Drove rigs after the war. There it was. The war. She didn't ask which one. She didn't have to. His face said enough. Vietnam, maybe Gulf. But more than likely, Vietnam. The years had settled into his skin in that way. In the lines around his eyes. In the way his hands never stopped moving. Even when they were still. She knew better than to ask the wrong questions. People who had been through hell didn't always want to talk about it. So she kept it simple. What made you stop driving? Walter set his spoon down. A small, bitter smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The body gives out before the will does. Tasha nodded. Yeah. Ain't that the truth? Silence settled between them for a moment. Not awkward, not heavy. Just there. A kind of understanding that didn't need words. Walter finished his soup and neatly folded his napkin. Like a man who had spent years following small routines. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the few crumpled bills he had. She saw the hesitation in his face before he pulled them out. How much do I owe you? He asked. Tasha shook her head. Told you, it's on the house. Walter didn't like that. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened. The way he shifted in his seat. I don't take charity, he said finally. It's not charity, she said. It's a meal. He exhaled sharply, staring at the table. I'll pay you back. Not worried about it, she said, standing up and grabbing his empty bowl. But Walter stayed firm. Someday, his voice held weight this time. I promise. She just smiled. All right. Someday. He nodded, then slid out of the booth. Standing with the stiffness of a man who had walked too many miles with too little rest. Before he left, he met her eyes. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds." She hadn't told him her last name. But before she could ask how he knew it, the bell above the door jingled and he was gone. What she didn't know was that someday was coming. Sooner than she ever could have imagined. The morning after felt like any other. The sun crawled lazily over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Tasha had the early shift, flipping chairs down, setting up syrup dispensers, and making sure the coffee was strong enough to keep truckers awake for another 100 miles. She barely thought about Walter Gaines. People passed through all the time. Some stuck in her memory, most faded away. He had seemed different, sure. But life kept moving. By noon, the lunch crowd was in full swing. Plates clattered, conversations blurred together. A man at the counter argued with Lou about whether ketchup belonged on eggs. Tasha was mid-pour, refilling a customer's coffee when she heard it. Engines. Not just one or two. A lot of them. It started as a low vibration in the floor, the kind that made the salt shakers tremble. Then, through the diner windows, she saw them. A convoy. 3. No, 4 military vehicles rolled into the parking lot. Big, serious-looking trucks. Not just some National Guard guys stopping for a bite. These were official. Government plates. Dark tinted windows. The diner fell silent. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even Lou, who never looked up from his grill, turned his head slightly. Tasha's stomach tensed. The trucks came to a stop, and then the doors opened. Men stepped out. Uniforms. Boots. Some in standard fatigues. Others in more decorated gear. Officers. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and graying hair, adjusted his cap and strode toward the entrance. The bell jingled as he stepped inside. Nobody moved. His eyes swept the room before locking onto Tasha. He walked toward her with the quiet confidence of someone used to delivering news. The kind that made people nervous. Miss Reynolds. Her throat went dry. She didn't like the way her name sounded coming from him. She forced herself to nod. "That's me." The officer removed his cap. The silence stretched. The whole diner was waiting. Eyes bouncing between them. Like a slow-motion tennis match. "Miss Reynolds," he said again. Voice even but firm. "Yesterday, you fed one of our own." Tasha blinked. "Excuse me?" "Walter Gaines." His expression didn't change. "You gave him a meal." Her heart thudded. "Yeah. I did." The officer glanced at the other men behind him, before turning back to her. "You didn't know his story," he continued. "But we do." Tasha felt a prickling sensation at the base of her neck. She looked past the officer, toward the trucks outside. Whatever this was, it was bigger than she'd thought. The other customers sat frozen. Forks hovering mid-air. Coffee cups clutched tight. Nobody dared to speak. Tasha exhaled slowly. "All right," she said, crossing her arms. "You mind telling me what's going on?" The officer studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the nearest booth. "I think you might want to sit down for this." She had no idea that what he was about to tell her would change everything she thought she knew. Tasha didn't sit. Something about the way the officer looked at her made her stomach twist. She had spent enough years reading people. Truckers on their 5th cup of coffee. Traveling salesmen with fake smiles. Teenagers trying to act older than they were. But this man, his face was unreadable. So instead, she leaned against the counter. Arms crossed. I'm listening. The officer glanced at the other men, before speaking. Walter Gaines isn't just a veteran. He's a decorated war hero. Tasha's brow furrowed. He didn't seem like the type to bring that up. The officer let out a breath. Almost like he expected that answer. He wouldn't. That's the kind of man he is. He paused. But there's more to it. A lot more. Tasha waited, watching him closely. The officer straightened, his voice steady. Walter served in Vietnam. Special Forces. His unit was ambushed in 1971. During a classified operation. He was the only survivor. He held off an entire enemy advance. Long enough for an evacuation team to pull out the wounded. Saved more than a dozen lives that day. She blinked. The quiet, tired old man. Who had counted his crumpled bills. Before walking into the diner. That was the same person he was talking about? The officer continued. He was awarded the Silver Star. The Bronze Star. And 2 Purple Hearts. Tasha's throat felt tight. But when he came home, things weren't easy. No one welcomed Vietnam vets with open arms. He struggled. Didn't talk about what happened over there. Eventually, he disappeared off the radar. Tasha swallowed hard. How long has he been living like this? The officer hesitated. Decades. He sighed. He worked when he could. Lived where he could. Never asked for help. Most people forgot his name. He tilted his head slightly. But you didn't. Tasha shifted under his gaze. I just gave him a meal. You gave him more than that, the officer said. You showed kindness when nobody else did. Tasha glanced toward the window. Where the military trucks sat like silent sentinels. A dozen questions raced through her mind. But one stood out. Why are you here? She asked. Why now? The officer hesitated. As if choosing his words carefully. Walter disappeared from our records years ago. He never claimed the benefits he earned. Never reached out to the people who owed him more than they could ever repay. We didn't know where he was. Until yesterday. Tasha frowned. How'd you find him? The officer's expression softened just slightly. He made a call. She stiffened. What? The officer nodded. After he left your diner, he found a payphone. Dialed a number he hadn't called in over 30 years. He exhaled. He said he wanted to come home. Something in Tasha's chest tightened. The Walter Gaines who had walked into Benny's diner the night before wasn't just a hungry old man. He was a man who had made a decision. Maybe the hardest one of his life. He didn't tell me, she murmured. The officer gave a small shake of his head. He wouldn't. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. So, what happens now? That depends, the officer said. Walter asked to see you. Her eyebrows shot up. Me? The officer nodded. He said, if it weren't for you, he wouldn't have made that call. Tasha stared at him, her mind struggling to keep up. She had known Walter for a grand total of 1 meal. 1 conversation. And now, she was standing in the middle of something much bigger than herself. She glanced at the booths. At the customers, pretending not to eavesdrop. Then back at the officer. Where is he? The officer motioned toward the door. He's waiting outside. And just like that, Tasha realized. This wasn't just Walter's story anymore. It was hers too. Tasha hesitated, her pulse picking up. Outside, the military trucks sat heavy in the parking lot. Their presence unnatural against the backdrop of the little roadside diner. The customers were silent, waiting to see what she'd do. Even Lou had stopped pretending to clean the grill. She swallowed hard. "All right," she said finally. "Let's go." The officer gave a short nod and turned toward the door. Tasha followed, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As soon as she stepped outside, the crisp midday air hit her, clearing the fog in her head. And there he was. Walter Gaines sat on the edge of the nearest truck's open tailgate. A wool, military-issued blanket draped over his thin shoulders. Up close, he looked even older. The deep lines in his face, telling 1,000 stories she'd never hear. His hands were folded in his lap, his fingers tracing invisible patterns against the fabric. When he saw her, he straightened. Tasha forced a smile. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again this soon." Walter let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't think I'd be seen at all." She crossed her arms, glancing at the uniformed men standing nearby. "So, what's all this about?" Walter's eyes softened. "I made a call," he said, his voice lower now, like he was still trying to believe it himself. "Told them I was ready." "Ready for what?" she asked. "To stop running." The words settled between them. Walter took a slow breath. "Spent too many years pretending I didn't need help. Thought if I stayed invisible, I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. But you." He shook his head. "You reminded me that people still care." "That maybe. I got more left in me than just waiting for the end." Tasha felt something in her chest tighten. She had no grand plan when she paid for that meal. She didn't think she was changing anyone's life. She just saw a man who was hungry and did what any decent person would do. But sometimes, the smallest things hit the hardest. Walter glanced at the officer, then back at her. "They're offering me a place to stay, a way to get back on my feet. And I want that." His throat bobbed. "But I asked them to find you. 'Cause I need to know something first." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Walter's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "Do you believe in second chances?" She exhaled. "Yeah, Walter. I do." He nodded, his lips pressing together. Then, with a shaky breath, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. Tasha frowned. "What is it?" Walter handed it to her. She hesitated before unfolding the paper. Inside, the handwriting was neat but aged, like someone had written it with careful purpose. It was a letter, dated 1972, addressed to Walter Gaines. She glanced up, confusion clouding her face. "I don't understand." Walter's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's my last letter home. Never mailed it." Tasha's stomach clenched. He swallowed. "I wrote it after that mission. Thought I wasn't going to make it back. But I did. And when I got home, I couldn't bring myself to send it." She stared at him. "Why?" Walter looked past her, his gaze distant. "Because I didn't feel like the same man who wrote it." Tasha let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the letter. She could feel the weight of it, not just the paper, but everything it represented. 50 years of silence. 50 years of regret. Walter's voice was quiet, steady. "If you believe in second chances, I figured maybe you'd help me send it now." Tasha swallowed hard. "To who?" Walter took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly. "My daughter." The words hit like a brick. Tasha's breath caught in her throat. "Your daughter?" Walter nodded. Haven't seen her since she was a baby. Left before I even got to hold her. Been too much of a coward to find out if she'd even want to know me. Tasha gripped the letter tighter. She wasn't sure what she expected when she walked outside. But it sure as hell wasn't this. Walter let out a breath, rubbing his hands together. She's out there somewhere. Her mother, Marcy, she tried to hold on, but I pushed her away. Thought I was doing them a favor. He let out a dry chuckle, void of any humor. I was wrong. Tasha studied him. And now? Walter looked up, meeting her eyes. Now I'm a tired, old fool. Who realizes that running don't fix a damn thing. Tasha chewed on the inside of her cheek, then exhaled sharply. You waited a long time for this. Walter gave a slow nod. Reckon it took me just as long to figure out what matters. Tasha glanced down at the letter. Yellowed at the edges, but the ink still bold. The words inside had been sealed away for over 50 years. What's her name? She asked. Walter swallowed. Angela. Angela Porter. Tasha's brows lifted slightly. Porter? She took her mother's name? Walter nodded. She didn't want anything to do with mine. His voice was thick, edged with something heavy. Regret. I was barely out of the service when I left. Thought I was doing the right thing. I see now, it was just the easy thing. Tasha let out a sigh. She had spent years listening to the stories people told over coffee. But this one was different. This was a life, splintered in two. A child, a father, a lifetime of missed moments. She looked down at the letter again. She wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. Didn't know if Angela Porter would slam the door in her face. Or even if she could be found. But something about the way Walter held himself. The way he clutched that blanket like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. She couldn't walk away from that. Tasha let out a sharp breath. All right. Walter blinked. All right? She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. I'll find her. A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Relief. Maybe disbelief. You'd do that? Tasha crossed her arms. Look, I don't know what she's going to say. I don't know if she'll even read it. But if you're serious about making this right, I'll do what I can. Walter's throat bobbed. I don't deserve. Nope, she cut him off, shaking her head. Not gonna let you do that. I'm not here to tell you whether you deserve anything. That's between you and Angela. I'm just here to make sure she gets this. For the first time since she'd met him, Walter looked lighter. Like a man who had finally set down a suitcase he'd been carrying for far too long. The officer stepped forward. Walter, it's time to go. Walter nodded slowly, then looked at Tasha one last time. If she don't want nothing to do with me, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Don't let it weigh on you. Tasha let out a short laugh. I'm a waitress, Walter. You think I haven't dealt with people yelling at me before? A slow smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Reckon you have. She held out a hand. Take care of yourself, Walter. Walter hesitated, then gripped her hand in both of his. His grip was weak, but steady. Thank you, Miss Reynolds, he murmured. Tasha nodded. And then, without another word, Walter stepped into the truck. The doors shut. The engines rumbled to life. She stood there, watching as the convoy pulled away, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the highway. The letter in her pocket suddenly felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had no idea what Angela Porter would say when she found her. But she was damn sure going to try. Tasha sat in her car, the engine off, staring at the envelope in her hands. The diner's parking lot was nearly empty now. The last traces of the military convoy long gone. The address on the letter was from another lifetime. Montgomery, Alabama. But people didn't stay in one place forever. Angela Porter could be anywhere. Tasha let out a slow breath. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't some grand messenger of fate. She was just a waitress who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But sometimes, that was enough. She pulled out her phone and started searching. It didn't take long. Angela Porter. 54 years old. Mobile, Alabama. Tasha stared at the screen. What the hell was she supposed to say? Hey, Angela, this is Tasha. You don't know me, but I fed your father a turkey sandwich, and now I have a 50-year-old letter he wrote you before he disappeared off the grid. Yeah. That would go over well. She sighed, gripping the wheel. There was no perfect way to do this. So she did what she knew best. She got up, got out, and handled it. Her fingers dialed the number before she could think twice. It rang twice. Then 3 times. Then. Hello? A woman's voice. Strong. A little cautious. Tasha swallowed. Hi. Is this Angela Porter? Silence. Then. Who's asking? Tasha gripped the letter in her lap. My name is Tasha Reynolds. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to keep going. I met someone recently. A man named Walter Gaines. Silence. Then a sharp intake of breath. Tasha pushed forward. He asked me to find you. He wanted you to have something. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then Angela finally spoke, her voice quiet. My father's dead. Tasha's throat tightened. No, ma'am. He's alive. A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper. That's not possible. Tasha closed her eyes for a moment. Then forced herself to speak. I know this is a lot. But he's alive. And he asked me to get this letter to you. Angela didn't respond. Tasha gave her a moment. Then finally. Where are you? Tasha hesitated, then said. Bowling Green, Kentucky. Angela exhaled. Shaky. Uneven. I need a minute. Tasha nodded, even though Angela couldn't see it. Take all the time you need. The line went dead. Tasha stared at her phone. That was it. No promises. No guarantees. But at least Angela knew the truth. She looked down at the envelope one last time. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some wounds never fully healed. But maybe, just maybe, this was a start. She slipped the letter back into her pocket, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. Sometimes kindness wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it was just a meal. A conversation. A moment. But those moments, they could change everything.